Good afternoon, and we welcome you all to this first of 5 roundtables on CES 40 years on. We're 40 years old this year. Europe, the disciplines, and the world. I suppose outside a university, the fact that Europe and the world have equal billing with the disciplines might seem a little strange and out of proportion. But of course, this is a university, and we should remember that some things can happen in a university that don't so readily happen outside a university. And I think this is one of them. It's become increasingly common for anniversaries to be the occasion for reflections on where we are, where we've come from, where we're going. I've just returned from the annual meeting of the German Studies Association. And of course, in German history, years with a 9 on the end have seen some celebrated events, many of which were reflected in the panels in Washington, D.C. 1939, 1949, 1989. Not to forget 1809, which was the birth date of Mendelssohn, and there was a Mendelssohn panel at the German Studies Association as well, as there might well be. 1809 was also the year, as I'm sure you know, of the birth of Abraham Lincoln and of Charles Darwin. So we can agree that 1809 was a good year. 1969 was, I think the jury's still out on 1969. As far as Harvard's concerned, it was a very lively year. And some of the events that took place that year probably garnered more headlines than the founding of CES. And involved the role of the Cambridge police, which was not, to the best of my knowledge, involved in the foundation or anything else to do with the founding of CES. But we are 40 years old. If you read the wonderful but very sardonic History of Modern Harvard by Phyllis and Morton Keller, Making Harvard Modern, you get a very interesting perspective on how centers were perceived a generation or so ago. They were often regarded as places where the faculty did themselves very well, rather lavish sybaritic affairs, money with no strings attached. That was the image of the centers held by, of course, by people who weren't involved in the centers. Money, no strings attached. It was never true, just as it's not true now, although slightly truer, that the centers resemble more strings with no money attached. But that's another story completely. What this center, like other centers, has always been is a place for the cross-fertilization, it's a bridge, a place where people and ideas come together. Between Europe and North America, between the generations, the role of graduate students, mingling with faculty and with visitors. That's always been central to what we do at CES. It's not just a sustaining myth, it's actually true that graduates have always been built into our activities. And that was very important 40 years ago when departments have changed a lot. The gap between departments and centers has narrowed in that sense. But then when departments were much more hierarchical, centers played a very important role for graduate students. But also, and not least, and this is the focus of these roundtables, it's the coming together of disciplines, interdisciplinarity, not just as a word, as a slogan, but as something that meant and still means something. But the question is, which disciplines, what kind of contacts, what kind of cross-fertilizations between the disciplines? The first of these roundtables will feature speakers from the classic social sciences, the once and perhaps still interlocutors of historians, such as myself, political science, sociology, economics. So let me begin by, I'll introduce the speakers in turn. None of them need much introduction. It's my dream team to begin these events. I want to start by introducing my colleague and friend Peter Hall, who's Crook Foundation professor, teaches in the government department. He's a former director and an extremely innovative director of the centre. His involvement in the centre goes back much further than that. He remembers the days of the chain-smoking Italian Gramscians when the centre was identified as the Centre for Euro-Communist Studies, I think, by some. His work on the state and capitalism, on inequality, latterly on health, are many. He is the quintessential all-purpose rounded political scientist, as well as a CES citizen, really without peer. So I'm embarrassing him now, but I couldn't imagine a better person to kick us off than Peter Hall to talk about political science and interdisciplinary contacts in CES. So thank you all for coming, and Peter, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, David. I can't live up to that introduction, that's for sure. But it's a pleasure to wish the Center for European Studies a happy birthday. Like many 40-year-olds, the center is looking more beautiful today than it did 40 years ago as a gawky teenager at 5 Bryant Street when I first came into contact with it. And that's partly thanks to Guido Goldman and the de Gunsberg family and the ineffable Sandy Selesky. And I think I would say with seminars on everything from political economy to cultural studies, CES now has a personality that is more worldly and sophisticated than it did in those days when we were sometimes thought of as a Center for Euro-Communist Studies, not without reason. But we're here to talk about the inner life of the center, or more precisely, the inner life of the field of European studies, and my remit is political science. David has taken the principles of Andy Warhol seriously and given us 15 minutes to speak, and one can't say much in 15 minutes, but I want to try to stimulate discussion with a few words about 3 questions. Where have we come from? That is to say, in the study of European politics. Where are we now in political science, and where are we going? So where have we come from? In 1969, in my view at least, and of course all I can express is my view, the study of Europe, like most other subjects in political science, was deeply influenced by 2 intellectual currents. The first was a modernization paradigm that embraced a hydraulic view of politics as a response to pressure from socioeconomic developments. Politics in some sense was flotsam and jetsam, floating on the waves of socioeconomic change. And this modernization paradigm came in 2 varieties, as many of you know. One, Marxism in tone and temper, saw political outcomes in terms of class conflict, itself shaped by underlying economic forces. And the epitome of this work, of course, is Barrington Moore's magisterial book on the social origins of dictatorship and democracy, which was published in 1966 and a very important reference in 1969. The other version of the modernization paradigm was decidedly more American and thus more optimistic. It stressed the ways, as you'll remember, in which economic prosperity produces higher levels of political development. And echoes of this view could be found, for instance, in Patterns of Government, the influential text, which I still think is well worth reading, edited by my friend and mentor Sam Beer in 1974, and to which Suzanne here contributed quite a remarkable chapter on France. So if the modernization paradigm was the first set of intellectual currents shaping our approach to European politics in 1969, the second, as I see it, set of currents were those left in the wake of the behavioral revolution, a movement determined to make political science more scientific by framing it as the study of political systems, systems driven by particular patterns of political behavior, behavior reflected in a set of political cultures largely understood as the embrace of specific political values. And just to make sure that I wasn't misremembering this, I looked back at the first volume of Comparative Political Studies, one of the major journals in the field, which began in late '68, and the first volume covers 1969. That volume contains an essay on the role of social classes in politics, reviewing works by Moore, Ralph Dahrendorf, and Gerhard Lenski. It contains articles by Harry Eckstein and Robert Hardgrave on political culture, an essay by Gabriel Almond on the process of political development, and that famous essay by Phil Converse on partisan identity in France and the US. Well, okay, this is a snapshot view in 15 minutes. Where are we now in political science? Well, a lot has happened since 1969, and since time is short, I'm going to mention only 3 major developments that I think are defining developments in the ensuing 40 years. The first of these was a rejection of modernization approaches, a rejection based on 2 sorts of grounds. On the one hand, modernization approaches were said to embody an overweening economic determinism that underestimated the creativity and contingency of politics itself. And Suzanne's first book, Peasants Against Politics, is, in my view, a powerful expression of this view. On the other hand, modernization approaches were pilloried for their naive view of social classes as historical actors. And David's book with Jeff Ely on the peculiarities of German history is a brilliant example of this kind of critique. So the rejection of modernization came first. Second, soon after 1969, the behavioral revolution was pronounced a failure, although like the French Revolution, it has left a few marks on the field. And it was succeeded by a rationalist revolution that rejected behavioral approaches to politics, including the study of political culture, in favor of models of politics based on simple rationalist assumptions about how actors behave. And third, again, to some extent in sequence, in response both to class analysis and to behavioralism, political scientists began to emphasize the way in which institutions, both formal and informal, structure political action and condition political outcomes. And a good deal of this ferment happened at CES. I remember debates in the seminars that David just referred to. So in 1979, Theda Skocpol and a number of other scholars, as we well know, take this approach by bringing the state back in. And this new institutionalism, as it was called, would have wide influence over the study of European as well as American politics. Now note that these developments reflect, I think, important changes in the character of interdisciplinary interchange, something, as David said, that's central to what the centers here do. 1969 was, in my view, the high water mark of an intense interdisciplinary conversation between political science, sociology, history, and economics. And circa 1969, this was facilitated by a social history that had rediscovered social classes, a sociology in which the structural functionalism of Parsons and Merton was still influential, and a vibrancy of an economic history that was still central to economics and interested in the economics of particular times and places. I think some of the works that I've just referred to could not have been written without that intense interdisciplinary interchange that spanned all 4 of those disciplines, and to some degree anthropology as well. Well, in the ensuing decades, those disciplines have drifted apart. Political science moved closer to economics, which forgot about history, but discovered institutions. Philippe may have something to say about that. And political science and economics engaged in, I think, a highly fruitful dialogue about the way in which institutions allow for the formation of credible commitments. So that's one side, history and political science moved together. On the other side, history moved away from sociology and political science to engage in closer dialogue with cultural studies, as the old social history gave way to a new cultural history. It's notable that there's no one speaking about history on this panel in the social sciences, and that this may reflect more than logistics. In short, the kind of interdisciplinary interchange that marked European studies for at least a decade after 1969, I think, has given way to new kinds of interchanges. And in the process, something of a chasm has opened up between history and cultural studies on one side and economics and political science on the other. Well, where do we go from here? The good news is that social science is still in motion. And this is partly because the younger generations sharpen their teeth on the skulls of older scholars. This is a process that is sometimes painful, but it's ultimately productive. Although not so productive if it's too painful. And there's dynamism too, because Europe itself is changing, of course. And I'll conclude with a few words about the movement inspired from both those bases. Well, in disciplinary terms, and I'm trying to provoke you here, but I'm provoking you sincerely. In disciplinary terms, I think the rationalist revolution has largely exhausted itself. Even economists have discovered behavioral economics. And in political science, there's a growing recognition that political outcomes cannot be adequately explained by recipes that contain only 3 ingredients: fundamental preferences, strategic preferences, and the institutions that condition the latter. This recipe makes some very lovely dishes, and I've tasted a number of them myself. But between the fundamental preferences that a theorist posits and the strategic preferences that institutions induce lies a vast land that is still, to my mind, largely terra incognita to political science, but of enormous importance for explaining political outcomes. If we want to know why someone votes for the Democratic Party, we have to consider that she does so based on a preference function with multiple variables in it, maybe based on her identity as a consumer, or as an environmentalist, or as a mother, or as a citizen of one sort or another. And how the weighting in that preference function, even from a rationalist point of view, is done is something that, in my view, can't be understood with more careful investigation, the bases of identity. So to explore this terra incognita, I think political science will need to think again about culture, construed in more sophisticated terms this time than the old arguments about political values. And I think we'll have to think about the ways in which identities condition preferences, even of rational actors. So we don't have to abandon a rationalist approach altogether in order to take on board a richer set of presumptions about how human behavior is conditioned. Some political scientists are already beginning to do so, and I think it's possible that this might bring about a new rapprochement between political science and sociology, as well as maybe even cultural history. And in the real world, of course, the object of study has changed. As David said, 1969 was followed by 1989. That may be the only statement I make that some people here agree with. The collapse of communism created a new Europe, along with issues of transition and consolidation, a transition to capitalism as well as to democracy. And these issues preoccupy a new generation of scholars. And of course, it goes without saying that Europe has also created a new political form, the European Union, whose intricacies and significance I think we're only beginning to understand. It's interesting to consider different approaches to the European Union. I think European scholars put the EU under a microscope. On this side of the Atlantic, we're more inclined to view it through a telescope, but I think there's something to be learned from both perspectives. And of course, if we think back to 1969, let's think back to October 14th, 1969. Let's take the example of Italy. Italy was in the grip of a hot autumn, marked by strikes and factory occupations that married a wave of class conflict to generational conflict, as similar events in France had done the year before. Well, if we look at Italy today, Italy's prime minister, while worrying a little bit about his popularity, although we don't know how much, is celebrating the success of recent measures to crack down on illegal immigration. So industrial conflict and the radical left haven't gone away, but the radical right is now stronger than the radical left in Europe, and issues of ethnic and religious conflict are at least as important as the class conflict so prominent 40 years ago. And that too, I think, is inspiring movement in our disciplinary agendas. So those examples are really only the tip of an iceberg, but I think we can say that in the face of that iceberg, over 40 years at least, the Center for European Studies has done more than rearrange the deck chairs on the Titanic.
Thank you very much, Peter. It's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, a good friend to the Center for European Studies and a faculty associate here. Michel Lamont is Robert I. Goldman Professor of European Studies and Professor of Sociology and African American Studies at Harvard. She's written many books. Many of you, I think, will be familiar with the most recent, still being reviewed. There was a TLS review just a few weeks ago, a very, very nice review. This is her work on peer evaluation and how it really works, based on much interview work. It's called How Professors Think Inside the Curious World of Academic Judgment, and it's to be much recommended. Michelle, the floor is yours to talk about sociology.
Thank you very much, David. I first want to thank you for inviting me to join this panel. Like Peter, I have very fond memory of the mythic 5 Bryan Street, where I spent a wonderful summer, the summer of 1987, which is also the summer when I got married here in Boston. And I remember being in my little office there thinking, wouldn't it be nice to come back here? So when I joined Harvard in 2003, of course, I was very much looking forward to having CES be part of my life, and it's been one of the great pleasures of being here. I reside next door in William James Hall, and I make my way here to the many talks, and of course, there's always too many, but it's one of the great pleasures, so I'm delighted to be here. Before saying a few words about the transformation in the role that sociology has played in scholarship on Europe, I thought I would say a word on the transformation of my discipline. Because just as the discipline has changed, the organization of the social sciences in Europe have changed, and this has certainly influenced how Europe is dealt with as an object on both sides of the Atlantic. So sociology went from probably what could be described as the structural 70s, a time when we were all reading, lots of what was written in sociology had Marx in the background, either as a foil or as a leitmotif, and the fields of sociology that were really booming at the time were fields such as structural study of inequality, political sociology, comparative historical sociology, often informed that by political economy. So the fields that have produced the great influence of Barrington Moore, Theda Skocpol, the description that Peter gave a little bit earlier of this conjuncture that brought sociology and political science very close to each other, in fact. Political sociology being in a period of enormous prosperity. With the end of the 70s, the turn toward the 80s, cultural studies, which was imported both from England through the Birmingham School and also through European, or French rather, cultural history, became much more influential across the social sciences as a whole, and that really created a transformation of the hierarchy of fields within sociology. And this is something that I love to talk about because it brought about a transformation of the position of my own subfield within the field, cultural sociology. And often when humanists and people outside sociology like to indulge in the stereotyping of our field. People often describe it as mindless number crunching, the arm of the capitalist state. I was at a talk last week given by Ulrich Beck to the Center for the Humanities, where basically the image of our field that he was providing. And I think that what we have, in fact, in the current situation is one I know, where cultural sociology as a field has exploded. It's now the largest section of the American Sociological Association that attracts the most graduate students. And this has happened in a context where the divide between qualitative and quantitative sociology, which really was undermining the field during much of the 60s, 70s, 80s, has come to an end. Most departments train their graduate students in a culture of multi-method research. And at the same time, other fields such as economic sociology have exploded. So you've had a overall rearrangement of the subfield around which our discipline is organized. And in that context, comparative historical sociology has not flourished. The peak of comparative historical sociology was probably the late 70s, early 80s. So this has very much influenced the place of the study of Europe in the discipline as a whole. At the same time, the configuration of the social sciences in Europe has changed. When I was a graduate student in Paris from 1978 to 1982, there was very little dialogue between the various national sociologies, or even, we didn't have the unbelievable structures that have been put in place by the European Union through various programs, through Erasmus, etc., to facilitate the creation of broad disciplinary or transdisciplinary networks in the production of social sciences. And I think that the creation of these networks was truly a revolution in the kind of European social science that we're now dealing with, and has really changed the relationship between American and European social scientists, although I suspect that many, many American social scientists have no idea the extent to which European social science has changed. Of course, also you have a number of fields, such as in countries, political science, I would say, has become more Americanized in Europe. The Germanic countries, Scandinavia, the English-speaking country, are now under much greater American influence. The situation is very different in Southern Europe and in France, I still think. So these various currents of communication, the extent to which scholars in the United States are reading European literatures varies enormously across subfields. And I would say that for the most part, although American sociology has become more cosmopolitan, many, many American sociologists still have very stereotypical views of what European social sciences or European sociology is. The stereotype being, of course, Habermas, Giddens, and Bourdieu, with no clear view of, the enormous amount of empirical work, quantitative and qualitative, that is being conducted. Of uneven quality, granted, but in each country, I think we can think of centers of production of sociology that are of very, very high level. And it's easy for American sociologists sometimes to indulge in the stereotypes in terms of thinking about our world of 4,000 universities, in the case of the US versus, let's say, the 80 universities in France, 80-some universities also in the other major European countries. How can these universes of such unequal demographic weight be understood to produce knowledge of equal quality? So these are the things, I think, if we want to develop a kind of sociology of this world of higher education that are truly incommensurate, we need to take into consideration when we want to understand how the kind of scholarship that emerges from these roles, from these words, and also mutual perceptions about meritocracy, processes for hiring, processes for promotion. I mean, the stereotypical view at this end is, of course, that in Europe it's all about clientelism, while most people have very little understanding of how exactly is recruitment, promotion, etc. done in Europe, let alone, you know, talking about differences between the various European countries, which are, of course, enormous. So this is my preface. Now, I've already probably used 5 minutes, right? I was going to speak a little bit about the movement away from European studies, area studies rather, in the social sciences as a whole over the last 30 years. In a nutshell, the major foundation that had been funding the social sciences, Mellon, Ford, came really to think of area studies as a field that was not adding too much in terms of theoretical production of knowledge. So this had a, I think, deep impact on some fields such as, you know, Asian studies. People studying Europe, I mean, we still valued having, you know, in-depth knowledge of the history and the languages that were necessary to develop a fine contextual understanding of the societies. But increasingly, graduate students were asked to demonstrate the significance of their topic of research in terms of what is this a case of? What are the big social processes, the mechanisms that could be understood through the case that was being analyzed? This really percolated into the criteria of evaluation that are used to distribute resources that are crucial to the reproduction of our field, such as the fellowship given by the Social Science Research Council called the International Dissertation Field Research Award, where explicitly the language that is used in the description of the fellowship is that the applicant should talk about what is this a case of. So I think this is a really very important transformation that had a deep impact on how we came to think about how the various disciplines were to approach Europe. We're not supposed to, you know, study Italy because we like Italy anymore, as to speak too much broader. Not that it was ever the case, I presume, but so within sociology, as researchers have never grouped themselves based on their geographic area. For instance, we know that historians differentiate themselves not only by country but also by period. This was never the case in sociology, which means that sociologists have tended to have a very weak identity as Europeanists. Instead, as I mentioned, we are organized around sections of the American Sociological Association, which are designated by substantive focus of research. So scholars working on Europe have tended to be assembled under the aegis of the section in comparative historical sociology, which historically has been the most Eurocentric of all the sociology section. In recent years, there's a number of scholars, Miguel Centeno, my former colleague at Princeton, for instance, who've shown how, you know, it was wrong to take the European case of state development as paradigmatic of the whole planet, and to show how, for instance, state development in Latin America had very little to do with the European case. So what we found as comparative historical has moved forward is really to try to differentiate processes in the global south in opposition to what had happened in Europe. Courses in the sociology of Europe are extremely rare, although Europe is a constant reference in courses in social movement, inequality, cultural sociology, to name only a few. And while the number of sociologists who work on Europe remains small, it is a very elite group that has produced a large number of disciplinary leaders. It's known as a very strong field. I mean, you know, if I think of the leaders of my generation, Peggy Summers, Rogers Brubaker, George Steinmetz, many of them work on Europe. So in part because I think many people who've worked on Europe have combined very strong theoretical background with in-depth empirical work. But of course I have my own interest in describing this field as particularly strong. So I'm losing my... so the study of Europe continues to influence the field of sociology through the mediation of central theorists such as Marshall, Jürgen Habermas, Pierre Bourdieu, Tony Giddens, as well as lesser figures such as Ulrich Beck. The influence of Marshall remains palpable in the writings on citizenship, ethnicity, immigration, race, models of social integration. Bourdieu, for his part, has inspired a great deal of comparative writing on system of inequality, the role played by symbolic boundaries in cultural hierarchies. So here again, I could give you a very long list. On the other hand, many Europeans don't travel that well. I've worked very closely with Luc Boltanski and Laurent Thévenot, and that there's been real limitation to the diffusion of their work in the United States due to very serious differences in intellectual styles. And you have, for instance, ethnomethodology and Chicago School ethnography, which are now extremely popular in Europe at a time when American sociologists don't view this as very important strands of work. So you have also very curious phenomenon of adoptions of styles of work that are historically associated with the U.S., but are being adopted for fairly bizarre reasons in Europe. Bizarre in the sense that the process of diffusion of work is not necessarily what one might have expected. So, against this broad background, that I've sketched, we can see that there's a changing relationship between American and European sociologists, and this may lead to a convergence in standard of evaluation and conceptions of what good research looks like. But we know that there's still many differences, and it is very difficult to imagine the day when greater integration will occur, I believe. This may not be a bad thing, as in sociology, perhaps unlike economics, studying many realities that are often incommensurate, and a flattening up of homogeneity and approaches and methods may result in the weakening of the discipline. In other words, I believe not all disciplines are meant to be consensual and to be unified. In our case, I think sociology distinguishes itself by the fact that we study basically everything. And you cannot produce a theory to study micro-interaction that is appropriate for studying broad processes of diffusion. And I'm absolutely in favor of promoting a discipline that is internally highly differentiated. I think it's totally suited for a discipline. And if we were to try to collapse these differences into one unified paradigm, we would not end up with a stronger sociology. We would end up with a sociology that might fit better the model of economics, but certainly would not be more useful for the study of social reality. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. Our third panelist is Philippe. May I introduce you just for a moment? Philippe Aghion. I probably don't know how to read the resumes of economists as well as I do those of historians and political scientists, but I recognize when someone has won as many prizes and medals and awards as Philippe Aghion has, that he's someone of exceptional stature. And indeed, the role he's played in so many different and key economics journals. He's currently the editor of the Review of Economics and Statistics, has been since last year. He's a faculty associate here. He's the Robert C. Waggoner Professor of Economics here at Harvard. His interests are particularly in growth, and I see his ongoing research includes an interest in innovation and growth, higher education and growth, policy and growth. So I get the point, growth. It's a pleasure to have someone to speak on the dismal science, as it's sometimes called, Philippe Aghion.
Thanks very much. So I may use some slides, but in fact now I restructured my speech, so I'm not using them. So how do we turn on the? Oh yes, exactly. Very good. Thanks, Ray. So in fact, I mean, so we were asked to think about the past 40 years and what has been learned, and I think there are three kinds of things at least. I think what has been the impact of the evolution in economic thinking or the thinking about economic policy on European policy. So that's one aspect. You could also ask, what what has the world to learn about from European experience? That's another part. And another thing would be to say, what have been the kind of innovations in economic theory or in economics that has really been initiated from Europe, or where Europe has played a big role. So on the first thing, what have been, if you want to look at the influence of economics, paradigm thinking, and policy making on European policy, my feeling is that there have been several phases, at least two phases, and I think it might be a third phase now after the crisis, maybe. So a first phase was like between World War II and the mid, so that goes back further than 40 years, but from World War II until the late 70s, you have that what I would call a kind of dirigist way of thinking. I mean, it was true also in the US. I mean, in the World Bank, you had the McNamara way of thinking, but it was kind of, government, limited competition, strong government intervention, Keynesian policy, you foster demand. That would be the way of thinking. That was the way of doing policy. And the kind of main paradigmatical references were Keynes, essentially, or, some version of planning or whatever. And that was the kind of way to think of policy making. A combination of Keynesian and dirigist, and you would get it. Then, starting in the late 70s, you have Mrs. Thatcher. And then you have it initiates, in fact, and it goes everywhere, the kind of I would call free market revolution. So the sense that, in fact, we had exhausted, but that came also together with the feeling that we had exhausted, the power of imitation. Essentially, Europe had policies which were good for imitating. So it was good to have, limited competition, strong government intervention. That's the kind of thing that works well where you are catching up. And we were catching up with the US, and we caught up a good deal between 45 and late 70s. But then we had exhausted, the power of catching up. It was innovation seemed to become the important thing. Technologies, innovation, ICTs, globalization. And for that, to do well in that new world, you had to move away from dirigist approach. So you would go into more free market. That coincided with the Russian expectation revolution, of course, which was going against Keynes. But also it coincided with the arrival of the new growth theories, which were not anti-Keynes a priori, but the growth theories would say let's take more of a supply side approach and emphasize the fact that, growth at that stage is driven by innovation, and you have to get the policies and institutions to foster entrepreneurship and innovation, like competition, flexible markets, financial markets more oriented towards stock markets, education systems more oriented towards higher education. So it was the view that you had to put in place new policies to, more combination of free market and acknowledgement of technology to make it further than what we had done, during the Trente Glorieuses. You see what I mean? So that kind of, I would say it's a mixture. I would call it a liberal. It's kind of emphasize higher education, but otherwise have the state withdraw and have flexible markets, essentially, deregulate. It's really at the deregulate phase. And then you have this crisis, and this crisis, questions things. It's that how have we gone too far in the deregulation? Should we re-regulate certain things? Also, it questioned, we saw during that crisis that the Stability and Growth Pact doesn't work very well. You had to, in fact, do away with it if you wanted to be sound during the last 9 months. Also, you had to be a bit minimum, depth to the, to the insistent calls of the Commission, the Competition Commission in EU, telling you that you should never help any bank, any firm, any sector, but just be religiously pro-market, pro-competition. And these kind of ways of pushing things became a bit under tension with this slight crisis. So people now are asking, are we moving towards the third phase, which would be a kind of maybe reconciliation between the first and the second. Maybe we went too far, believing that you have to deregulate everything, that the state should withdraw from everything. And maybe we should go, you should say, well, we acknowledge competition, we acknowledge the role of flexible markets, but we need state intervention to ensure against new risk, about the risk of being unemployed, the risk, the environmental risk, And that's a bit what, the Scandinavians are doing. So people now are asking, what is the right model? Is it the US or is it all Scandinavia that somehow managed to combine flexible markets and but also role of the state in these kind of things? Okay, so that's the first part. The second part, if you ask, that's so maybe we may come to a kind of synthesis and evolution in paradigm thinking, and so the second part is lessons from European experience. I think that's again is the comparison between the Scandinavian model and the EU and other models in EU, and have we learned something from it? Okay, so that's I think something that teaches us something, and that from which even the US can work. After all, there is the debate on health system in the US, and people in the US are looking at the French system, at the UK system, at the Scandinavian system, and they look there. I mean, to say, it's not in China they're looking in Europe to see how they could have a good health system, no? Or how they could have infrastructure, or how could they, so that's interesting. I mean, that's the thing that can come from. The third aspect is, what kind of new economic thinking was initiated from Europe. I think I see at least 3 areas which really seem to have a lot emerged from Europe, actually. One is economics of inequality. There's been a lot of studies recently on the high incomes. The fact that, over the past 30 years, high incomes have, gone up a lot. And it's for Thomas Piketty, Tony Atkinson, who is visiting Harvard this year. Emmanuel Saez is in Berkeley, but is very much influenced by these people. So that's been the economics of inequality, which has influenced the current administration. Krugman, has written about it, but I mean, Obama, in his inaugural speech, mentioned that work, and that really initiated in Europe. I mean, so that's one area. Another area is the economics of trust. Is to say institutions is important, but trust is also important. And why do you explain that, for example, France has high regulation and low trust, but in a sense, Scandinavia has lower level of regulation and higher trust? How you do go from one to the other? What is the link between regulations and trust? What is the role of trust in the growth process? What is the link between inequality and trust? That's something which is initiated in Europe. And the third thing is regulation. I mean, Toulouse, for example, in France, has been a center, it's not the only one, that has thought a lot about how to regulate monopolies, but now also to regulate financial intermediaries. And that, I think, is something that has come for Europe. Do I have a little bit of time?
Please do, yes.
A little bit. So I wanted just to show you a few things, just some figures. I mean, about, this, for example, shows the government share of GDP, so in various countries. But what you have most of the time, what you see, is that from the 1940s to now, it has essentially gone up and down in various countries. So in some countries, it has gone down a lot lately, and in others not. But that looks at my paradigm shift. Here you're in a period where you believe increasingly in government intervention, and then you stop believing in government intervention, more or less, and you have a reversal. So that's my 2 phases. You see what I mean? So for example, of course, some like the United Kingdom reduce a lot, that's Mrs. Thatcher. She reduces a lot the government share of GDP. But of course, others like Norway or Denmark, much less. You see what I mean? So it's interesting that some countries have reduced a lot the government share of GDP, others less. You see what I mean? And that's what created this distinction that Sapir looks at between various different types of countries. That's one dimension on which you could distinguish them. To which extent have they really deregulated and withdrawn the role of the state? I think that's an interesting question to ask. So for example, those have maintained the green, but the non-green have not maintained, have gone, the government share of GDP has gone down a lot in those where I don't put the green, you see? So that you could separate between the green and the non-green, you see already, and have something to say. So another thing I wanted to show you is just a few graphs, which are just telling you something. So that's about the 2 phases. And now you see you have the crisis. And when you have the crisis, you can look at private consumption over the past year by quarters. And you see what's interesting is that, that's the second quarter of 2009. And you see that consumption in the UK falls a lot, whereas consumption in the Scandinavian countries or in France or in Germany doesn't fall that much. So that's a very interesting thing, is that in a sense, Germany, the Scandinavians have put in place safety nets. It's very hard to read, but and I don't have much time. But we could look. I could distribute the slides, and then you could look. But for example, if you see Finland is right there. Of course, if I show you, it doesn't go down by much. For example, but if you look at you see a number of countries where private consumption goes down more than in others. So it's interesting that in a sense you see that that some countries had very good automatic stabilizers that maintain consumption, and other countries didn't have the stabilizer, and consumption went down a lot. And as a result also, production went down more. So it's interesting that the crisis revealed that having a good system, you know, a good safety net, good system of maybe important after all. You see what I mean? Maybe we went too far, believing that, you know, deregulate, withdraw the state, and that's it. Well, you know, when you have this kind of things, it's not so bad to have, you know, things that maintain private consumption. You see? And what's very interesting is that countries that the UK that didn't have this system, public debt had to increase a lot in the UK. So you see that even countries that had not initially invested in, you know, public debt has increased, you know, everywhere. That's the blue, the dark blue is the 2010 public debt over GDP, and whereas the light blue is the 2007. And you see that it's very interesting that countries, you know, even the UK, which is more like the model where the state would withdraw, was forced to increase a lot public debt during the crisis because they had, well, of course, to bail out the banks, but also because they didn't have the safety net. Well, they had to intervene. They could not just not intervene. So they had to do it, but they didn't finance that through taxes. They financed that through essentially. So other countries that could have had a good tax system, like Denmark, for example, didn't have to increase that much public debt because they could rely on the tax system. You see what I mean? Whereas the UK, which didn't have the appropriate tax system, had to increase public debt a lot. So I just want, I just want to show you this. That's the Sapir distinction between the, you know, I'm sure you're used to that. André Sapir had a very successful paper in front of politics, you know, that makes this distinction. You could separate EU countries between those who have low and high efficiency, which he measures by employment rate, but you could measure by growth rate. And then you can have another dimension, which is equity, which is poverty line. How many people are below a kind of poverty threshold? And what's very interesting is that in the high efficiency, you have two kinds of countries, the Nordic and the Anglo-Saxon. And so prior to the crisis, you would say, well, you know, it's your peak. You may decide that you want, like the UK, where you have paid less tax, but you have more inequality. Or you have the Nordics, where you pay more tax, you have less inequality, more public services. It's your peak, you know. But both of them do well on unemployment. And whereas, you know, here, in the continental, it's more like Germany, Holland, and things. And here is, you know, the Mediterranean more, and which are both bad on both the dimensions. And then, so you say, well, okay, at this point of the day, you say, my choice is between those two, in a sense. You see what I mean? So it's not clear, you know, which one you would want to have. And then comes the crisis, and the problem is the sustainability. So what's very interesting is that you see the in 2004, it's public debt over GDP. So those are the levels you have. And you say, well, it's true that the Nordic and Anglo-Saxons are good because they tend to have also lower debt as a percentage of GDP. The Nordic because they have higher tax, and the Anglo-Saxons because they don't tax much, but they don't spend much either. Okay, so they manage. Okay, they sustain. It's two ways of doing it, and they do pretty well. Whereas the other ones do pretty poorly. Okay, well, France is included, of course. Okay, so now you ask yourself between 2004 and 2010, and that's very much the thing, is that you see that all those guys, but of course those do even worse. The Anglo-Saxons increased public debt a lot, and the thing is that, you know, the Nordic barely increased public debt. You see, they didn't need to do it. The system resisted. You see what I mean? They had put in place a system which resisted the crisis very well, and in fact, they had even put a system to regulate banks because they were hit by a bad financial crisis in the 90s. So they knew how to set up good regulations for the financial system that resisted very well the latest crisis. So if, in a sense, you know, to my mind, you know, the crisis shows the superiority of the Scandinavian model in Europe. I mean, undoubtedly, I don't see any advantage of the UK over Scandinavia, honestly. The model reconciles priority. So you tax, but you know, you use the tax money, and you use the tax money first to maintain harmony, you redistribute, but you also use the tax revenues to give priority to higher education, R&D, green innovations, and at the same time also to finance the labor market system, and that allows you to maintain a very flexible labor market, because the great achievement is that they take on board the lessons from the second phase that I was mentioning. You have flexible markets in this. They play the game of competition. You have flexible product market, flexible labor market, but they have the safety nets that allow them to sustain it. So I just wanted, now I'm done, I've passed my time, but I thought there was, so I think this idea that you have a compromise between flexible markets and the state that comes back but assumes a certain roles to sustain the flexible market is an important idea. And it's an idea true within countries, but it's an idea I think which applies also in Europe. I think one of the smartest guys I've heard so far in the European debate, I mean in Europe itself, is Prodi. Prodi says, look, Europe as it is, it's not sustainable. What you should, on the one hand, you have the Anglo-Saxons who said, you know, deregulate, but we don't have fiscal coordination. And on the other hand, you have countries like France that are very tempted, or Germany, that are very tempted by protectionism. But on the other hand, you know, and so you have these two type of countries. You see what I mean? And so Prodi's idea is to say, well, let's sit together. Let's have France and the UK talk together. And the UK tells France, don't become protectionist. And France tells the UK, stop with fiscal dumping. Let's have fiscal coordination. You see what I mean? And then we can do something which works together, which makes the single market and the flexible market sustainable, because thanks to the no dumping on the fiscal front, we can set up a system that will finance higher education and that will also finance the safety net that make the flexible market sustainable. So I think that might be, you see, that's where I think that's what I wanted to say. Thanks.
Thank you. I think my question would be whether Iceland is a Scandinavian country, but don't answer it immediately.
No, it's not. In that respect, the answer is no.
It must be Mediterranean. Okay. It's my pleasure finally to introduce another very good friend of CES, Suzanne Berger of MIT. Peter mentioned her first book, Peasants Against Politics. She has written many books in the sphere of comparative politics and political economics since that book appeared in 1972. She's currently exploring in her work the impact of globalization on the domestic political and economic structures of advanced industrial countries. There is no expectation that you will be able to summarize or draw a nice clean line under the talks that we've just heard, but it's a pleasure to ask Suzanne to offer some commentary on the very broad and rich themes that have been sounded so far. Suzanne.
Thank you very much. I guess I was here present at the founding of CES, and so it's an enormous pleasure to be here today and to think about the intellectual community that has been nurtured by CES over 40 years. And as someone who's a teacher at MIT, I have to say how enormously important CES has been for those of us at MIT, our generations of students who have studied here with all of you and have had offices both at Bryan Street and then here as well. And this has been an enormously important community for us as well. So thank you for that. When I think back on the first generation of CES, I guess my memory of what social science was like in those years is a little different than Peter's, and I thought this was really kind of so different to think about our memories. My memory of 69, 79 was a period of explosion of interest in reconceptualizing the relations between economy, society, and the state. And that in response to two huge shocks. And the first shock were the waves of mobilization in the United States over the Vietnam War and civil rights movement, and in Europe, basically huge anti-capitalist explosions. And these explosions of these waves of mobilization were totally unanticipated. When I think about what people's expectations were about Europe, I think there's nothing more important than going back to a volume of Daedalus that was called The New Europe. that came out in 1964. And in that volume, which was the work both of Europeans and Americans, there's no trace of the idea that there's anything. This is a kind of domesticated society in the process of a deep death of ideology, class conflict, class warfare, profound contestation of the market are at an end. And so that 4 years later, you saw what we saw in May, June 1968, or in the hot autumn of Italy, or what we saw in Germany. These were totally unexpected for social scientists, and I think unexpected for those of us in this community as well who studied Europe. So the first shock was that Europe turned out to be a fundamentally different place than we had understood. And secondly, I think the second big shock was the rise of Marxist theorists across the social sciences. I mean, those were years in which all of us read and analyzed the differences between Poulanzas, Althusser. I remember teaching Poulanzas and Althusser to students, James O'Connor and others. And I think these two great shocks, both the rise of Marxism in the social sciences and the shock of discovering that the place you thought, the societies you thought you understood were profoundly different places than you had imagined, produced an enormously fertile set of responses in American social sciences. And those responses and the people who responded to them made CES one of the most exciting places in the world to be a scholar in those years, 69, 79. And I think in those responses, I think of a work like Theta Scotchbold bringing the state back in. I think about those people who started working with Barrington Moore, someone like Peter Gorovitch, whose work was profoundly influenced by Barrington Moore, even if Gorovitch ends up at a very different place than Moore did. I think about the work on reconceptualizing interests and interest group intermediation, and that first committee of the Social Science Research Council, with the Social Science Research Council on Western Europe, which really was an extension of CES into the SSRC. The people on that first SSRC committee were all CES people, virtually. Klaus Offe had all spent significant time here. Klaus Offe, Jürgen Koche, Charlie Mayer, Wolfgang Streeck, these were all, and others were all people who'd spent a lot of time here. And in some sense, that group was an extension of conversations that had been initiated here at CES. And my pages are not turning. And I think the third of the kind of responses that one saw particularly clearly here at the center was a new focus on labor and trade unions. And in fact, the CES in that period with George Ross produced a set of books and papers on trade unionism. Andy Martin was very involved with that effort. So what grew out of this ultimately, I think if you look at what after 69, 79, 79, 89, what grew out of this in 79, 89, I think is an intellectual tradition that today is very vibrant. That's historical institutionalism, which is a part of social sciences that I think, alas, in sociology may not be flourishing, but certainly in political science is a flourishing part of the discipline, and that continues to emphasize context, to emphasize a focus on change, on how institutions either are reproduced or not reproduced over history. And in this part of the discipline, I think we continue to see a strong interest in Europe. I mean, think about people like Peter Hall, Kathy Jo Martin, Jonah Levy, people who have grown out of the CES, Kathleen Phelan, who have grown out of the CES tradition, who today are the strong points in historical institutionalism. But as I look at historical institutionalism in the social sciences and in my own discipline in political science, I think that the chasm, if there is a chasm, between historical institutionalism and the rest of political science has widened over time. And here I'd just like to read you a little, and knowing that I was coming here today, I picked up a book called Political Science, The State of the Discipline, that was brought together by Helen Milner and Ira Katznelson. And I looked at an essay by David Layton on comparative politics. And this is what David Layton writes about historical institutionalism. He says, because of the methodological orientation of historical institutionalists, the literature they produced was rich in narrative. That means something like history, actually. They have continued to write empirically dense narratives that speak directly to the dependent variables that have defined statistical and formal research, but their impact on the practice of statistical and formal modelers has been limited. And then he goes on to discuss Peter Katzenstein's work in some detail, and he concludes from Peter Katzenstein's impact on the social sciences. In general, the fuzzy variables that attracted the historical institutionalists as consequential rarely find their way into cross-sectional and statistical research or informal theories of the market. Well, since we know, thanks to counting that Donald Green and Ian Shapiro have done, that in political science, starting from 1957, when 0 articles in the American Political Science Review had any formal models of the market or rational choice, to 1994, when almost 50% of the articles were formal. The fact that historical institutionalism has, as Layton describes it, so little impact on the rest of the discipline, this is really too bad for historical institutionalism. But I think it's also very much too bad for the study of Europe, because much as Michel has described in sociology, it means that those who study Europe have become progressively isolated from the rest of their disciplines with relatively little impact on what goes on in the rest of the social sciences. And I think this is much too bad. It's too bad for historical institutionalists. It's too bad for the study of Europe. And for those of us who are the teachers of future generations of scholars, it's been very sad to see a tremendous decline in the number of graduate students who are interested in studying Europe, and as Michel has said as well, a transformation of what we expect such students to know about Europe. I remember in preparing my generals that I was going to take at Harvard in political science, as I was working on France, that I agonized over whether I would remember the names of the presidents of the Third Republic. I agonized over whether I would be, what I could say about different electoral systems. Nobody today would ever imagine that somebody preparing generals in comparative politics who said that she was interested in France, no one would dream of asking a question about the Third Republic, except the most general and vague of questions. So the content of what we expect people to know about these societies, even for those few who are focusing on this, has really been transformed. I think this is bad not only for historical institutionalism and the study of Europe, but I think it's bad for the social sciences across the board, because Europe remains for us the mirror in which we can find others who we can most readily identify with and learn something from. Learn something from, whether it has to do with how we might reform our healthcare system, learn something from with respect to how issues of inequality might be dealt with otherwise, learn something from, as Philippe has expressed, with respect to regulation. And I think we have come further and further from any ability to really translate, understand European experience in our own work and in what we're able to produce for the rest of our discipline. So the question is, what could be done about this? And more specifically, what could CES be doing about this? we're at a moment of crisis since 2007, and crisis has, I think, at least two meanings. If you're having a fever, crisis means the moment in which your fever peaks, and then the expectation is you return to normal. But the other sense of crisis is the possibility of opening, of change that would lead to something that would be something really quite different than before the moment of crisis. And I think that at this point, we're hovering between these two understandings of what 2007, 2009 mean for our understanding of capitalist, liberal, democratic societies. And that rethinking this question is something in which CES could play a truly vital role if it could once again try to bring together scholars from diverse disciplines to try to understand what we have to learn from Europe and how the very different disciplinary perspectives that even are arrayed at this table might contribute to this learning. Thanks.
Thank you, Suzanne. My thanks to all of the panelists. I think we should open discussion straight up to the audience. So I see there are quite a number of students present. I would encourage you not to be shy. Well, in my experience, Harvard students are not shy, but please do ask questions. But I'm inviting questions. If you could identify yourself before you ask your question, that would be helpful to all of us. Charlie.
The oldest student in the room.
The oldest student, still learning.
It was even forgotten 40 years ago. But my memories of it, I mean, I'd like to...
Charles Mayer.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Charlie Mayer, as Suzanne said. First SSRC group, although a year after Suzanne, and the year later here. I think Suzanne's memories are right of '69 and this dual shock. I mean, the '60s were so turbulent, and we were trying to take account of it, and it was a revival of Marxism. But you know, Peter, you made a sort of throwaway comment that history is not on this panel. History will have its own panel, but of course, had this been earlier, we would have been on this panel. And one of the changes, of course, is the way history has gone. I think from social science, and I think in general, I'd say what we presupposed in '69, the Marxist project presupposed, and I will follow with dates with nines, was in a sense what you substructure and superstructure. Political action was defined by social forces. You discussed them. I think this in a sense was the political economy seminars. This was the sort of unwritten, not unwritten. It was the leitmotif through so much of what we were doing. So you just had to get the substructures right and how to debate them. And a lot of the Marxist discussion is about that and whether the state was within them or above them. 1979, 10 years later, then came the other shock in a certain sense, that as Philippe says, the Keynesian model was voted out in England, then a year later, in a sense, voted out in the United States. It took a long while for those changes to register in some ways, and so and this started in. People were interested in superstructure, and the historians certainly were interested in superstructure. People decided their affiliations, their loyalties, their political outcomes, maybe on rational means, maybe not on rational means, but they weren't necessarily just the hydraulic pressure, as Peter has called it, of groups. The substructure, in a sense, started to fade away, or new substructures came in, new loyalties, which one of the big changes, of course, is we had religion was not thought of really very much, except perhaps with Catholic Democrats and the like, and all of a sudden this became a preoccupation. 1989, we had to get even leading it through repression, the difference between East and West, which was also a reflection of a dropout of a substructure, the Marxist model, which had separated the 2 Europes. And it's not quite 1999, but 2001 maybe, and this is what Suzanne is lamenting. In a certain sense, Europe is marginalized in some of this, and we don't really know what we're doing. Many in the students David and I have, so many of us are doing much more Europe and non-Europe together. How does, whether it's colonialism, the impact of that, whatever. And I think this is, Suzanne, you're right in the sense we have to open up, but I'm not sure that the learning process from among ourselves is necessarily seen by this new generation as where the useful knowledge will come from. I mean, if you ask me, as a historian looking back on the 21st century, it will be the century of, which Asia has closed the gap of a 300-year retardation vis-a-vis Europe. This is a huge process to assimilate, and how we adjust to that, I'm not certain. We were all at the center in some ways 40 years ago of talent, and it's in a sense, Europe is Europe has lost an empire but not yet found a role.
Thank you. I want to collect questions. I would particularly like to have questions from those who perhaps weren't alive when CES was founded, those perhaps even whose memories of Mrs. Thatcher are fairly dim. My own memories of Mrs. Thatcher are quite dim, but that's a world act of amnesia on my part. But, other questions, comments? Yes. If you could identify yourself.
Excuse me, Andy Martin from the Center for European Studies, almost at the beginning. I think nobody mentioned capitalism in the panel.
I think it was mentioned.
Was it mentioned?
Nobody mentioned gender, but capitalism was mentioned.
Yeah, well, that's true. In terms of where we go from here, some weeks ago, Wolfgang Streck was here, and we talked a little bit about a book, the latter part of which is a plea. He didn't talk much about this part of the book, but the most interesting part of the book was a plea to bring capitalism back in. Whereas Joshua brought the state back in many decades ago. I wonder if the panelist thinks it is time to bring capitalism back in and make that a large focus, which would not, of course, be a focus simply on Europe, but maybe include Europe and non-Europe to a great extent. But that's okay.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, sorry, capitalism with respect to what? Because before it was Marxism and now capitalism? Or in which sense you want to bring, what do you mean by bringing capitalism back in?
You talked about capitalism as a system, as a whole process. Streck put it in the context of, in a way, connecting to what you were talking about, a reaction against deregulation.
Yeah.
He's asking whether we are possibly getting into a Polanyian counter-movement to deregulation. But the focus of it is whether capitalism can be re-encapsulated, re-embedded in a variety of institutions which tame it, which control it. So that's the sense. The large system, which uncontrolled seems to have a very much a dynamic of its own, which is destructive.
Thank you. The back.
Yeah, just a little question. My name is Marius Busum. I'm a visiting scholar here, but usually based at the Max Planck Institute in Cologne. So I wonder about Susan Berger's comments. I wonder whether this is also a story about European political science drifting apart from American political science, because speaking from a more European or German perspective, I would say that these kinds of hyper-formalized studies, this is not about quantitative or qualitative methods, this is really about formalized models versus empirical way of doing political science, I would say. I would say that it's completely the opposite way around in Germany, at least, that these kinds of formal models that are oriented very much towards mainstream political science in America, they are still quite marginal in Germany. And in fact, we see a resurgence of qualitative or multi-method work. I would say that historical institutionalism, especially when European scholars study European Union or European politics, is still very much alive and expanding. So maybe this is also something about the differences between European and American political science, and that's of course interesting to reflect which role the CES could play in this process.
Yes.
Thank you.
I was struck by the contrast between the first two speakers and the second two speakers. For the first two speakers, the change was expressed almost entirely in disciplinary terms. In Peter's talk, we had disciplines moving toward and away from each other at various times. Michelle's talk was structured around the organization of the sociological profession. In Philippe's talk, we had external events impinging very strongly on the kinds of questions that economists considered central. And in Suzanne's talk, events were central. My memory agrees with hers that in 68, 69, there was an upheaval that changed our perception of Europe. But I think that although Americans discovered Marxism then as perhaps a way of theorizing the situation in which they found themselves, a situation they didn't expect to find themselves in, when they went to Europe, they found that Marxism was already a declining discourse. Certainly in France, Marxism was under heavy critique from structuralist philosophers. It was no longer the cultural center, even if it still had a political influence that waned over time. But I think that was a counter shock, that one went expecting Marxism to have a certain role, and it turned out that Europe had moved on from there. Perhaps that explains why people who went as professional students of European politics were then turned inward toward the profession, and why you have professional internal historical explanations on the one hand and external on the other. But I still find the disparity between the two halves of the panel curious, and I'd like to try to understand why that happens.
Thank you. Please do.
I just want to tell Archer that we were given two questions, and I think Peter and I picked one of them, and Philippe picked the other one. The questions were how the study of Europe has changed and how it might continue to change, and then shift in the disciplines about European relationships between them, which is what we did.
Thank you.
Why do you choose those questions? And
Yeah.
why do you
There's a question at the back.
Sabrina Zeig, I'm a PhD student from Germany visiting here. They have a question for Peter Hall and Michel Lamont, and on the collaboration or the future collaboration of political science and sociology. You mentioned in your presentation that you see a possibility that political science now looks for the different foundations of preference formation, looks to sociology for looking for identity concepts or things like that. So can you maybe say a few more words? What do you think about, in which direction is it going? What do you think? Does political institutional theory look for another foundational action model, action theory, or where's the point?
Thank you very much. I want to give the panelists a chance to respond to these questions. Okay, I have one question of my own, but if I could ask, I think I saw you at the back first.
Carsten Schneider, a visiting fellow right now here, and a follow-up question to that one before. I was struck by Peter Hall's suggestion, which essentially I thought was still remaining on the individual level. And I remember a talk at my home institution, which is the Central European University in Hungary. There was Reinhard Selten, a former Nobel Prize winner, who won the Nobel Prize for his work on rational choice, and he said this is dead. So he said this is a dead-end road. We should not try to understand macro phenomena through micro level analysis. We never managed to aggregate this into macro, and so I was somehow now surprised, if I understood correctly, the suggestion by Peter Hall that we should continue to do micro level analysis. That's the one thing. And the other suggestion or idea that came to my mind is how does CES see its role with regard to the formation of younger scholars? What is striking is that many Europeans seem to come to America, but not so many US students, younger scholars, move to Europe. And so this is often a one-way exchange. So, and in a sense, CES is contributing to this, to our advantage. But for a real exchange, there should be a counter institution somewhere in Europe who brings many more Americans to Europe, I'd say.
Thank you.
Yes, Giovanni Boccia, I'm a visiting scholar here. Very short question. A recurring theme in most of the presentations and even in some of the questions is that the last 40 years were characterized by the decline of the influence of the Marxist paradigm in the social sciences. I was wondering whether you could say something more from your point of view on what explains that. Is that a Kuhnian story? The paradigm didn't survive its own anomalies and couldn't explain reality as efficiently as it was believed it could at the beginning, or is it's a practical failure after 1989 in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union that explains that, and how, if so, are these two things connected?
Thank you. Peter.
Yeah, my name is Peter Burgard. I'm in a sense an outsider, although I am on the standing committee in European studies. Haven't been here as much in the last decade as I was in the previous decade for various reasons. But so my interests focus very much on the questions of interdisciplinarity that Peter and Reza and Professor Lamont, first name basis. Yeah. Okay. Well, I haven't gotten to the question yet, so I will speak up now. I'm wondering why there isn't more interdisciplinarity, there aren't more interdisciplinary connections between sociology and political science, at least the political theory wing of political science, and then also history, insofar as the history department at Harvard has become a major force in intellectual history, and then moving over into the humanities, to philosophy, and to the literature fields, because there is a common basis for discussion, and that is a large body of philosophically theoretical texts, which are in large proportion German, French, and Italian, and I'm wondering why, if you would speculate on why that hasn't held interdisciplinary discussion together within the social sciences, but also between the social sciences and some fields in the humanities.
Thank you. One more question from the floor, then I want to add a question which partly piggybacks on what Peter has just asked.
Just a very short follow-up on what he said. I don't know his name. My name is Kimana Flut. I'm a visiting scholar here at the center. And actually, what Peter Hall said about the methodology of rationalism, of shifting away from it, that was already in talk at the beginning of the century in science philosophy. And we already went through that whole discussion in science philosophy. And it seems like there is no communication between this kind of philosophy that also went to political philosophy, and then political theory and political science. And maybe what he was just saying, that there should be some kind of communication between these, these different, what do you call them?
Fields.
Fields, yes. Thanks.
Just, two comments before I invite the panelists to make some closing remarks. One is that inevitably we have 5 roundtables, and political economy isn't the only game in town at CES or in the intellectual world. And music, art, cinema, language, literature, history, even history of science will make their appearances. In some ways, of course, in trying to make rational groupings, one risks replicating classic. I mean, it would be interesting to mix music, economics, sociology, and French. Perhaps it would even have made sense as a provocative act, deliberately to jumble. but I didn't. And in some ways, I hope that these conversations will become cumulative. I mean, it's more of a comment than a question. I was going to ask provocatively whether the panelists, given the strong animus against what rational choice theory has done to their disciplines, whether they saw any redeeming features in formal modelling, whether any at all. Let me put it differently, though, just make a comment on what seems to me a striking discrepancy between, say, history and history of science, where you would certainly have to say that formal theory, whether it's counterfactual theory or indeed thinking about what microhistory means, or whether it's the use of Foucauldian theory, or something like actor network theory in history of science. These have marked the growth of formal theory within history and history of science, and on the whole have not been seen as creating a movement in the direction of sterility. On the contrary, on the contrary. And is it the particular kind of theory we're talking about here? So it seems to me a very striking discrepancy between the way in which theory has entered. Of course, there are historians who would say that these theories have been entirely destructive, but that would be a minority view, I think. So I would just want to point to that striking discrepancy. I suppose with my provocateur's hat on, I would want to ask whether you see any gains from rational choice theory, or whether it's all bad news. So that's just a simple little explosive question to tack onto the end of the many excellent questions and comments from the floor. I think, shall we go in the order in which the speakers originally spoke? Peter, you garnered many questions.
Well, I've got about 2 minutes, right? If we're equitable about this.
2 or 3 minutes, we can run over.
2 or 3. Oh, thank you.
You get to say the good word about rational choice
Yeah,
theory,
I
so
will.
that gives you an extra minute right
Yeah,
there.
I will. Okay. I'll be telegraphic. I mean, because the issues that are raised here are really worth many more minutes of discussion by all of us. I enjoyed these other presentations very much. I wanted to dissent very slightly from Suzanne's view, just because, not because I have to, but because I want to. I think that historical institutionalism retains a more central role in mainstream American political science than your portrait might suggest. I could easily be wrong about that, and this is one of those things that it'd be fun to discuss at greater length. But I see, and I also think that, I think there's more question about where the study of Europe fits into American political science, given that the European energy footprint may be as large as it has always been, but its intellectual footprint is smaller. But when I look at, I think there's a resurgence of interest in democratization, for instance, and to which Giovanni, among others, here has contributed, but Daniel Zivlot at the Center contributes to it, Tom Erdman, a number of others. I think that actually makes connections to the work in economics of Asimoglu and Robinson and others. I wasn't entirely fair to economics in my 15 minutes. There are ways in which history now figures, again, quite prominently at the center of some important inquiries. And so I, for reasons that I can't elaborate, am actually, so therefore, Marius, I don't see as big a divide between the European and American fields as there might be. David Layton's totally idiosyncratic article was inaccurate when it was printed some years ago, and is even more inaccurate today, as I pointed out to him at one point. Even though I believe it, isn't that the article in which he also loves my own work? I think so. The other kind of work. That's my second point, the rational choice work that I do, and which I think has brought enormous advantages to the discipline. So I meant to be critical of all camps, but not especially critical of rational choice, because I think that that paradigm in political science has been an enormously fruitful one, and that's one reason why it is so influential. And I'd have to have more time to say why I think that is the case. God. I mean, I'd love to answer some of these other questions, but I have to stop.
I'd be glad to give you a couple of minutes to say why you think rational choice has indeed been beneficial. The telegraphic question.
Well,
That was your question.
It's your question.
well,
It's abuse of the chair.
Yeah, yeah.
Well,
But you all want to know, though, right?
Yeah.
Privilege of the chair.
I think because, well, one reason would be because I think most human beings are relatively rational actors. So that does give them some leverage over a variety of outcomes. Secondly, I think it has made this interchange with economics possible, and while that may have come at the cost of some other interchanges, I think that it's been fruitful for both sides of that interchange, and that I think that there are a bunch of thought experiments we could perform, which we don't have time to perform. One would be to ask yourself, all right, so what do you think are the 10 most important books about the politics of Europe written in the last 20 years, right? Now that would be really fun, although we shouldn't put it on the website. But I would say that if we asked another question, what are the fundamental intellectual developments that are solid and can provide a basis across a number of the social sciences that have appeared in the last 15 years, I would say research on credible commitments and how institutions foster credible commitments would be one of them. And that this move to look at trust in economics is unbelievably retrograde because it steps away from an understanding of how trust turns not on some generalized attitude that some people might have and others might not, but it turns on institutions. I trust Michelle, but if I'm going to buy a house from her, I want a lawyer.
Okay, great. Thank you, Peter. I'm so glad that I did offer the time, because I think we all wanted to hear that. And so, Michelle.
Yeah. So I think I'll pick only two questions. The question of interdisciplinarity. In my view, there's several interdisciplinarities that are very much alive in contemporary American social science. When I taught at Princeton for 15 years, the dialogue between the cultural historian and Clifford Geertz was enormously lively and inspiring. The key figures were Donaldson and Davis. There was no, of course there were exchanges between political scientists and economists, but the economists there were much more privatized than they are here. So they did not at all influence the zeitgeist on campus. So for me, this dual cultural history and cultural anthropology and qualitative sociology, is one of the very lively, clusters that we see today. There's also, of course, here the methodologists and the Americanists in political science are closely allied. So it's not. I mean, if I look recently, because of my dear collaborator Peter Hall, I somehow happened to check Google Scholar. I mean, I don't have a global map of what American political science looks like, but the numbers are enormous. So, which would lead me to be maybe more optimistic than Suzanne about the impact of hysterical institutionalism. Maybe I don't know who is. I mean,
did you refer to hysterical institutionalism? That's the new paradigm.
So anyway, so that's the first point. Someone asked about collaboration between political science and sociology and culture. So since Peter did not answer, I will answer because I think it's a wonderful opportunity to plug in our new book, because Peter and I have been collaborating for the last 5 years on a project on a research program which we co-direct called Successful Societies, which addresses in part the question that Suzanne asked us to raise, which is what do we have to learn from Europe? And I will not tell you how we define successful societies. There will be a panel on this in a few weeks. But I would say that in that context, we very much have worked together toward thinking about what is the impact of cultural repertoires, of models of social inclusion in fostering more healthy societies. So that might be one of the ways in which, to address the question of trust that Peter just mentioned. These questions, models of recognition, simply have not figured out very much into political science conversations over the last few years. And they come out of political philosophy, the work of Fraser, etc. So personally, I see a great deal of opportunities for cross-fertilization, and I feel when it comes to disciplinary collaboration, there are some collaboration that come very naturally and are effortless, and these are the ones that we should follow. It's a little bit like water spreading. It will spread very easily when there's natural affinities, and there's no point to fighting those where it's just not happening. So my motto has been, you know, let's play with the people with whom I'm having fun and ignore the others, you know. And for that reason, I might be a little bit more optimistic than you are, Suzanne, because you know, there's a lot of really interesting things happening in many disciplines. And
that sounds a little bit, excuse me for interjecting, a little bit like what I might call parochial interdisciplinarity.
Mm-hmm.
You know, play with the people you have fun with, because you can potentially learn a whole lot more from people you don't have fun with.
That's true, but life is short, you know.
Yeah.
Pleasure is a very important motivation for intellectual life.
Having fun with economists. Philippe?
Or just so I mean, I don't know, I mean, I just wanted to make three remarks. I mean, one on rational choice, I mean, which I'm not, my very limited understanding of things is that there's been a kind of, on the one hand, in economics, a whole literature on experiments, for example, trying to show whether we observe the people reactive to incentive schemes the way we would predict. And it seems that in many local experiments, people seem to react. Now there are two kinds of ways. So of course we also know that in many situations people depart, or there seem to be a departure from the predictions of rational choice. So I think the important challenge, which behavioral economics has not yet completely addressed, is to try and understand how the circumstances or the institutions that you are embedded in make you deviate one way or another. Yeah. So I think, you know, because there are many ways of the problem is that rational choice is like a focal point, is like a benchmark. The problem is that you could deviate from it in many ways, and it's not clear how you deviate and when you deviate from the various ways. And so that's we don't understand that very well. You see what I mean? So sometimes we know, for example, when you have a big crisis, you become much more impatient. No, or you start doing things very. So some friends or some colleagues of mine, like David Lepson, analyze, you know, when people in situation of stress and emergency, different parts of the brain becomes active and they behave differently. But those are things we don't yet understand well. You see, I mean, how particular circumstances or particular situations of stress in organizations, for example, make you deviate more or less from what you would the prediction of rational choice. I mean, the other thing is also you may have a collective deviation. That's what the crisis we had. Maybe individually people were rational, but the collective outcome was crazy. So that's more a different thing. Is the collective thing looks irrational, and it's a coordination problem. Yeah. And very often things that you attribute to non-rationality may be in fact a consequence of lack of coordination between individuals. And when you look at the family is irrational. It's just maybe a lack of coordination. So that's kind of first. I don't know if this helps or to put some kind of empirical thinking, you know, elements in this debate. The second thing is the capitalism. I think there is a big issue, you know. I think we've learned, you know, the past 40 years, I mean, clearly now the socialist system is not an option anymore. I mean, it's clearly, there was at some, you know, in my youth, we believed that you could go from capitalism to socialism, and that you could make socialism more democratic, and now we know that, you know, the socialist system doesn't work well, and that what works is capitalism. The whole question now is which kind of capitalism. And in a sense, because now we got rid of the question, should it be socialism versus capitalism, we can really focus on the question of which model of capitalism we want. And what's very interesting is that I see some kind of convergence there. Because on the one hand, you have European countries that want to emulate many things in the US, have more flexible markets, imitate the university system in the US. They want to take good things from the US. On the other hand, I see now the US wanted to look at the health system in France or in other countries, you know. So this may converge. I mean, we may end up with, you know, at least something, you know, we are looking, we start from different ends and we learn from each other. Maybe CES can be a place where Europeans and Americans learn from each other on what the right model of capitalism should be. You know, I mean, they could research on, learn from each other's experience. Of course, there is this whole matter of, you know, the relationship with state markets, how much we want the state, how much. Well, guidance, the third way, was the idea you need both. but it didn't go very far. We don't understand how much of both you need. And this pops up anytime you ask about environmental policy. Part of it will be the states doing environmental policy, will be part of it will be the companies, will be the private sector. Which part is done by whom? That's not well understood. The relationship between regulation and trust. I had a paper with Algan, Cahuk and Schleifer coming out in the Huge on this question. But I think this is an enormous question. Most of it remains to be done. That I think, learning from looking at the Europe and American situation and comparing them, teaches you on those general questions. Coming to the CES, my feeling is that really the CES, there should be several things. I mean, it can be typically a laboratory for the US to learn how to reform or not reform, looking at experience of Europe, because here are many countries which are rather developed and try various things, work, don't work. It's like a natural experiment laboratory for the US to understand how to reform its own system. And also you have a lot of Europeans in the US or in Harvard, MIT in particular, or BU, who would love to work on general issues. You see, for example, you want to make pension systems for academics transportable from one country to the next. It looks a very stupid question, but it's a very important one. How you do that? How you, you have this governance in Europe. Should you allow a subgroup of countries in Europe to initiate and to have decision-making power without having the unanimity rule? And how can you go beyond the unanimity rule? I mean, that's a big question. I mean, those are things where scholars, and you have a number of scholars from Europe, they want to help in the process in Europe, and they would love to use this kind of thing. And CES could be a place where they could do that, I think. The problem is that, in Europe you have Bruegel, but Bruegel is very much about applied policy. Bruegel doesn't do much in terms of conceptual things. And I don't think there is in Europe any place that I know about, seriously, maybe there are some, and Max Planck, maybe in Cologne or whatever, but that are known to really have thinking on how you could overcome a number of really, how can you enforce more counter-cyclical policies in Europe, given that you don't have coordination among European countries. How you can, those are very practical questions. They require thinking. And that thinking is not happening in Europe. And maybe it could happen here because you have people from many European countries in one place that could be focused here and work on those things. So my feeling is that there are various avenues, various ways for CES to become relevant, to remain relevant. Anyway.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Finally, Suzanne.
Well, it's late, and I would like not to lose in the course of our conversation a point that was made by, was your name Marcus? Marius. At the back of the room, which is the role that CES might play in trying to get more Americans moving towards Europe. That it's great that CES remains open to younger European scholars or to European scholars, but I think we have to really ask ourselves, why is it that this looks so often like a one-way flow? And I know that focusing on issues of money is a sort of lowly concern in lofty intellectual discussion here, but I think there's been a big process of disinvestment in European studies. The foundations that Michel mentioned, Mellon, Ford, all of those, who in fact supported all of our research when we were younger scholars, none of them do this any longer. And at the moment, I think it's extremely difficult for those of our students who would like to be able to move in the other direction to find the support to do so. This is something that we don't really say out loud because it's sort of, it doesn't rise to the stature of an intellectual concern, but it is important.
Yes. No, thank you. Point taken. I think things look a little less pessimistic in history. But there is a reception upstairs to which you're all invited. Let me remind you that there is the second of these roundtables is on November 18th on history, science, technology. I hope you'll all come back. Come and bring your friends. Thank you for your attendance. Thank you for your questions. And will you please join with me in thanking all of our panelists who've done such a great job today.